You boys ever wonder if the wind is laughing at you? The voice came from behind the firing line, low and gravelly, almost lost beneath the restless sweep of desert air across the range. Gunnery Sergeant Ethan Cole didn't turn at first. His eyes were locked through a high-end optic mounted on a precision rifle worth more than most pickup trucks in the parking lot. The target sat far out across the valley, a steel silhouette no bigger than a dinner plate at nearly a mile away, shimmering through layers of rising heat. Cole exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger, and waited. 3 seconds passed. Then 4. Somewhere in the distance, dust kicked up just off the left side of the target. Another miss. The sound of frustration moved quietly down the firing line. 10 Marine snipers had been working the shot since sunrise, and the scoreboard at the edge of the range was still empty. The wind flags snapped in 3 different directions like they couldn't agree with each other. Mirage waves twisted above the baked rock like invisible rivers. Ballistic computers chirped quietly on wrists and tablets, recalculating solutions that looked perfect on screens but kept failing in the real world. Cole lifted his head and muttered under his breath, his jaw tightening. The exercise was supposed to be the crown jewel of the week's advanced sniper course. Tomorrow morning, a visiting general would watch the final demonstration. But right now, after 6 hours and hundreds of rounds, not one Marine had managed to wring that piece of steel. Behind them, a small knot of observers had gathered along the gravel berm, mechanics from the motor pool, a couple range staff, and one thin old man standing quietly with a long cloth-wrapped object resting in his hands. His jeans were faded, his olive jacket older than half the rifles on the line, and the desert wind tugged at his silver hair like it had known him a long time. He had been there nearly an hour, watching without speaking. Until now. Cole finally turned, irritation already rising before he even looked. "This is a restricted training range," he said sharply. "Spectators stand behind the berm." The old man didn't move. His pale blue eyes drifted across the valley instead, studying the flags, the rocks, the thin ribbon of scrub grass halfway to the target. "You're reading the wrong wind," he said quietly. A couple of younger snipers glanced back, unsure whether to laugh or ignore him. Cole let out a short breath through his nose. "We've got kestrels, ballistic solvers, and satellite weather data feeding our solutions," he replied, gesturing toward the cluster of electronics spread across the shooting mats. "I think we're good." The old man nodded slowly, as if he expected that answer. "Maybe," he said, "but that bullet doesn't care about your screens. It's flying through 3 different winds before it even reaches that steel." A faint murmur passed along the line. Lance Corporal Noah Briggs lowered his spotting scope slightly, staring at the distant valley again. For the first time all morning, something about the strange old man's words made the chaos in the mirage start to make sense. Cole noticed the hesitation and stepped forward, his tone sharpening. "Sir, unless you're here to mow the grass or fix the fence line, you need to move along." The old man gave a small, almost apologetic shrug. The cloth bundle shifted in his hands, and for a moment the worn walnut edge of an old rifle stock peeked from beneath the fabric before the wind folded the cloth back over it. A few Marines smirked. One whispered, "What is that, a museum piece?" The old man didn't react. He simply kept watching the valley like it was telling him something the rest of them couldn't hear. And for reasons none of them could quite explain yet, the wind across the range seemed to grow just a little quieter. The desert wind slid across the firing line in long, restless waves, rattling the thin aluminum legs of spotting scopes and tugging at the edges of shooting mats spread across the gravel. Gunnery Sergeant Ethan Cole slowly stood from his rifle and stepped away from the scope, rolling tension out of his shoulders as he looked back toward the old man standing near the berm. The Marines on the line had stopped adjusting turrets for a moment. Curiosity had begun to compete with frustration. 6 hours of missed shots had a way of making even the most confident sniper start listening to strange voices. Cole folded his arms across his chest. 3 wins, he repeated, the words coming out with a thin edge of disbelief. "You saying 10 Marine snipers missed a target because we forgot how wind works?" The old man did not look offended. He shifted the cloth bundle slightly in his hands, the shape of the long rifle beneath it becoming clearer as sunlight slid across the worn fabric. "Not forgot," he said calmly. "Just looking in the wrong place." One of the younger Marines let out a quiet laugh under his breath. Another shook his head and returned to adjusting the elevation turret on his rifle, as if the conversation was not worth the distraction. But Lance Corporal Noah Briggs kept his eye behind the spotting scope, watching the shimmering valley again. Heat rose from the stone ridges like invisible currents in water, bending the air and distorting the distant steel plate. Briggs had been studying that mirage for the last 20 minutes, and something about the way the waves moved at different depths had been bothering him. The old man's voice had placed words on the feeling he could not explain. Cole stepped closer now, boots crunching across the gravel until he stood only a few feet from the stranger. "Let me get this straight," he said, gesturing toward the empty scoreboard at the edge of the range. "You walked onto a United States Marine sniper range, watched for 10 minutes, and figured out something our equipment missed." The old man gave a small nod toward the valley. "I have been watching longer than 10 minutes. Cole followed his gaze. The first wind flag near the firing line leaned steadily to the right, snapping sharply in the dry air. The second flag halfway down the valley drooped almost straight down with only a slow, lazy flutter. The third flag near the steel plate flicked left in quick, nervous bursts like it could not make up its mind. 3 different answers to the same question. Briggs lowered his spotting scope completely now, his brow tightening. Cole noticed and gave him a brief look. "Something funny, Lance Corporal?" Briggs hesitated. "Sir, the mirage about 800 yards out is flowing opposite of the flags." Cole dismissed it with a small wave of his hand. "Thermal drift. Happens every afternoon." The old man's quiet voice returned again. "Not drift." Cole looked back at him. The old man pointed slowly toward a jagged rock shelf halfway down the valley. "That ridge catches the afternoon heat and pushes air straight up. The valley pulls it sideways. Your bullet goes through both before it ever sees the last wind near the target." The Marines along the line grew quieter now. Even the faint clatter of magazines and bipods slowed. Cole gave a short chuckle and shook his head, though the certainty in his expression had softened just a little. "And you know this how?" The old man shifted the cloth covering the rifle in his hands, revealing more of the dark walnut stock beneath. The wood carried the deep shine of decades of oil and careful handling. Near the bolt, a long gouge scarred the surface like a small lightning strike frozen in the grain. "Because this valley is not the first place that tried to fool me," he said simply. The wind moved again across the range, and for the first time that morning, several Marines on the line began looking at the valley instead of their computers. The range fell into a strange half-silence after the old man spoke. The wind still moved across the valley, the flags still snapped and twisted, and the distant steel plates still shimmered in the heat, but the rhythm on the firing line had changed. Marines who had spent the entire morning trusting screens and digital readouts now found their eyes drifting toward the rocks, the grass, the uneven ripples of air that danced above the sun-baked ground. Gunnery Sergeant Ethan Cole noticed it immediately. Confidence was a fragile thing on a sniper range, and the moment doubt slipped into the line, it could spread faster than the wind itself. He stepped forward another pace, boots grinding softly over gravel, until he stood almost directly in front of the old man. "You have been watching longer than 10 minutes, Cole repeated slowly, studying the stranger's calm expression. "That still does not explain why you think you understand this shot better than the Marines training here." The old man did not answer right away. His pale blue eyes moved across the valley again with patient attention, as if he were listening to something invisible moving through the air. The cloth bundle shifted slightly in his hands, and the dark walnut rifle stock showed again, the long gouge near the bolt catching a sliver of sunlight. One of the younger snipers leaned toward another and whispered quietly, "That rifle looks older than the base." A few quiet chuckles followed, but they faded quickly when Cole did not laugh with them. Lance Corporal Noah Briggs had lifted his spotting scope again, though now he was not watching the target. He was watching the ridge the old man had pointed out earlier. The mirage there twisted differently than the rest of the valley, like heat rising through a narrow funnel. Briggs shifted the focus ring slowly. The air at 600 yards drifted one direction. The air beyond 800 yards moved another. And closer to the steel plate nearly a mile away, the wind flicked sideways in short, unpredictable pulses. 3 winds. The phrase settled in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. Cole noticed Briggs adjusting his scope again and gave him a brief look that was meant to pull him back into discipline. "Eyes on your own lane, Lance Corporal," he said. Briggs straightened slightly. Yes, Gunnery Sergeant. But he did not lower the scope. The old man watched the exchange quietly, then finally spoke again in the same calm voice. You are all solving the same problem, he said. Your computers assume the bullet travels through one wind from here to that steel. He nodded toward the distant target glinting faintly under the desert sun. But that bullet does not care about your math once it leaves the barrel. It only cares about the air it touches. Cole crossed his arms again, though his expression had grown more thoughtful than annoyed. We calculate layered wind drift, he replied. That is what the software does. The old man gave a small patient nod. Yes, he said, but software cannot feel the way the valley breathes. A light gust moved through the firing line just then, sliding across the gravel and lifting a faint ribbon of dust. The nearest wind flag snapped sharply to the right again. Halfway down the valley, another flag hung nearly still. Briggs watched the mirage shift like slow-moving water. For the first time all morning, the pattern looked less like chaos and more like a puzzle waiting for someone who had seen it before. Cole looked down the line at the 10 Marine snipers lying behind rifles worth tens of thousands of dollars, their gear polished, their training precise, their pride very real. Then he looked back at the quiet old man holding a rifle wrapped in cloth. All right, Cole said at last, his voice measured now. Instead of mocking, if the valley breathes the way you say it does, explain something to me. He gestured toward the empty scoreboard again. How would you solve the shot? The old man's eyes returned to the distant steel plate, and for a moment the wind across the valley seemed to pause as if it were waiting for the answer. The valley held its breath, while Gunnery Sergeant Ethan Cole waited for the answer. Even the quiet clicks of adjustment knobs along the firing line slowed as 10 Marine snipers listened without pretending they were not listening. The old man studied the distance a moment longer before he spoke, his voice calm and steady like someone describing something obvious that others had simply overlooked. First, he said, you stop looking at the target. Cole raised an eyebrow slightly. A few Marines exchanged confused glances. The steel plate nearly a mile away had been the center of their focus all morning, the single stubborn point that refused to ring. You are aiming at the wrong thing, the old man continued. The bullet does not travel straight through the picture you see in the scope. It travels through the air between here and there. He slowly lifted one hand and pointed toward the jagged rock shelf halfway down the valley. That ridge pushes hot air upward every afternoon once the sun settles over it. It bends the path of the bullet before it even reaches the midpoint. Briggs followed the direction of the finger through his spotting scope again, adjusting the focus ring until the mirage sharpened. The waves of air above the rock shelf twisted upward like a slow, invisible chimney. He had seen it earlier, but now it looked different, more deliberate. The old man lowered his hand and pointed again, this time farther out where a narrow strip of pale grass cut across the valley floor. Then the valley pulls the wind sideways along that grass line. It is subtle. Most people miss it because the flags above it hang still. Cole glanced toward the middle wind flag that barely moved, then back to the grass line the old man had indicated. Briggs shifted his scope again and saw the faintest sideways ripple moving through the mirage there. A ripple none of the digital readouts had mentioned. The old man continued quietly. And then near the target, the valley opens again. The wind loses the sideways push and snaps back the other direction for the last few hundred yards. A long moment of silence settled across the range. Cole looked from the distant steel plate back to the old man, his arms still crossed, but his posture less rigid than before. You are describing 3 different corrections, he said. Our ballistic solver accounts for layered wind. The old man gave a small nod, patient but firm. Layered wind assumes those layers stay consistent. This valley changes its mind every few hundred yards. A light gust rolled through the firing line again, lifting a swirl of fine dust that drifted toward the berm before settling back to the gravel. One of the younger Marines shifted slightly behind his rifle and muttered, almost to himself, that actually explains the drift pattern. Cole heard it, but did not comment. His eyes stayed on the old man. All right, he said slowly. Let us assume you are right. He gestured toward the rifles laid out along the line. What does that change? The old man finally lowered the cloth bundle slightly in his hands. More of the rifle beneath the fabric appeared now, revealing a long barrel and the polished walnut stock worn smooth from years of use. The gouge near the bolt caught the sunlight again, deep and unmistakable. The Marines nearest to him leaned forward slightly, curiosity replacing earlier amusement. The old man looked down the valley once more, measuring the invisible movement of the air with quiet attention. "It means," he said softly, "that the shot is not impossible." Cole's jaw tightened slightly. "Then why has nobody hit it all morning?" The old man lifted his eyes from the valley and met the gunnery sergeant's gaze for the first time since the conversation began. "Because everyone here is trying to fight the wind," he said, "instead of letting the valley carry the bullet through it." The words hung in the hot desert air, and somewhere downrange the steel plate glimmered quietly under the sun, as if waiting for someone who finally understood how to reach it. The words settled across the firing line like dust after a long drive across the desert. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The Marines looked downrange again, not at the glowing numbers on their ballistic screens, but at the valley itself. The rock shelf, the pale grass strip, the distant shimmer around the steel plate. Gunnery Sergeant Ethan Cole studied the old man with a tighter expression now, the quiet certainty in the stranger's voice beginning to press against his professional pride. Finally Cole let out a short breath through his nose. "That is a nice theory," he said. "But theories do not ring steel." A few Marines along the line nodded faintly, the comment giving them something familiar to hold on to. The old man did not react. He simply stood there with the cloth-wrapped rifle resting in his hands like it belonged there. Cole stepped closer and reached toward the rifle bundle, stopping just short of touching it. "What exactly do you plan to do with that?" he asked. The old man gently lowered the cloth another inch. The rifle beneath it was unmistakable now. A long, slender barrel with a deep blued finish. A classic bolt-action receiver. And the dark walnut stock worn smooth by decades of careful use. It looked nothing like the modern precision rifles lined up along the firing line. The optics on it were simple. The metal carried the faint polish of long years rather than factory shine. One Marine near the end of the line let out a quiet chuckle. "That thing belongs in a museum." Another added under his breath, "Probably shoots minute of barn door." A few small laughs followed, but they faded quickly when the old man slowly uncovered the rifle completely. Sunlight slid across the walnut stock and stopped at the deep gouge carved into the wood just behind the bolt handle. The scar looked old, almost part of the rifle now, but it was impossible to ignore. Cole noticed it immediately. "That rifle been through a war or two?" he asked, half joking. The old man looked down at the mark for a moment before answering. "It has seen weather," he said quietly. Briggs leaned a little closer behind his spotting scope, studying the rifle now instead of the valley. Something about the way the old man handled it did not match the image of a confused civilian wandering onto a training range. The movements were slow, but deliberate. Familiar. Cole gestured toward the firing line with one hand. "These Marines are using the best equipment available," he said. "Computers that calculate wind drift down to the mile per hour. Precision optics that can measure distance down to the yard." He looked back at the old rifle. "And you think that old piece of walnut and steel is going to solve what all of this could not?" The old man rested the rifle lightly against his shoulder, not in a firing position, simply holding it the way someone might hold a tool they had trusted for a long time. "It is not the rifle that solves the shot," he said calmly. Cole crossed his arms again. "Then what does?" The old man lifted his eyes toward the valley once more. The wind flags flicked again in 3 different directions. Mirage rippled over the hot rocks like water. The steel plate waited nearly a mile away, still silent after an entire morning of attempts. "Listening," the old man said. A few Marines shifted awkwardly. One whispered, "Listening to what?" The old man's gaze remained on the valley. "To everything your screens cannot hear." Cole studied him for another long second, then finally stepped aside and gestured toward the empty firing position at the center of the line. His voice was calm now but firm. "All right," he said. "Show us what you mean." For a moment nobody moved. The desert wind whispered across the gravel firing line and tugged gently at the corners of the shooting mats as 10 Marine snipers watched the quiet stranger step toward the open firing position. Dean Carter moved without hurry, the old rifle balanced naturally in his hands as if it had rested there 1,000 times before. The cloth that had covered it slipped away and fell loosely across the bench behind him. Sunlight warmed the dark walnut stock, and the long gouge near the bolt caught the light again like a scar that had long ago stopped hurting but never disappeared. Gunnery Sergeant Ethan Cole folded his arms and stepped slightly to the side, giving the old man room, but keeping his eyes fixed on every movement. A few Marines leaned forward, curiosity now stronger than amusement. Dean knelt slowly and set the rifle down on the mat with quiet care. The metal made a soft sound against the gravel beneath the pad, a small mechanical click that seemed louder than it should have been in the still afternoon air. He did not immediately lie down behind the rifle. Instead, he remained kneeling, studying the valley. Again, his pale blue eyes moved slowly from the first wind flag snapping near the line to the jagged rock shelf halfway downrange, then to the pale strip of grass and finally to the distant steel plate shimmering in the heat. Lance Corporal Noah Briggs watched through his spotting scope, but now his lens followed the old man's gaze rather than the target. Dean lifted one hand slightly and closed his eyes for a moment as the wind brushed across his face. The gesture looked almost strange to the Marines on the line. One of them whispered quietly, "Is he actually feeling the wind?" Cole did not respond, though the question had crossed his mind as well. Dean opened his eyes again and finally eased himself down behind the rifle. The movement was smooth despite the years in his shoulders. He settled into the mat as if the ground had been shaped specifically for that position. The old rifle rested on its bipod, the barrel pointing toward the distant valley but not yet aligned with the steel plate. Dean adjusted the stock slightly into his shoulder, then lifted his head just enough to look across the land again instead of immediately through the scope. The Marines watched in silence. Most of them would have already begun dialing wind corrections or checking their ballistic tablets again. Dean did none of that. His left hand brushed lightly across the gravel beside him, picking up a few grains of dust. He let them fall slowly. The tiny particles drifted to the right, then curved gently back to the left as they dropped. Briggs saw it through the corner of his scope and felt a small chill move down his neck. Dean leaned forward now and placed his eye behind the simple optic mounted on the rifle. The glass was clear but lacked the complex reticles and digital readouts the Marines used. He looked through it for only a second before pulling his head back again. His eyes returned to the valley itself, the ridge, the grass line, the distant shimmer of rising heat. Gunnery Sergeant Cole finally spoke, his voice lower now than it had been all morning. "You going to take the shot?" Dean Carter rested one hand gently along the worn walnut stock, his fingers passing over the deep gouge near the bolt as if acknowledging an old memory. Then he looked downrange once more and spoke softly. "Not yet." The Marines remained still as the wind shifted again across the valley, and for the first time that day it felt less like noise and more like a conversation that only one man on the line seemed to fully understand. The firing line remained perfectly still while Dean Carter waited. The desert sun had begun to lean slightly west, and the valley heat shifted with it, bending the air in slow wavering currents that rolled across the distant terrain. Gunnery Sergeant Ethan Cole stood a few steps behind the mat, arms folded tightly across his chest, watching the old man with a focus that had replaced his earlier skepticism. 10 Marine snipers lay behind rifles worth tens of thousands of dollars. Yet every eye on that line had drifted toward the quiet figure resting behind the worn walnut stock. Dean had not moved for nearly a full minute. His cheek hovered just above the rifle comb, not yet settling into the optic. His eyes were still studying the land beyond the scope. Lance Corporal Noah Briggs followed the same path through his spotting scope. The jagged rock ridge at 600 yards shimmered with rising heat. The pale strip of grass beyond it swayed, almost invisibly. The steel plate nearly a mile away glinted like a tiny mirror under the sun. Briggs noticed something then. The heat waves rising from the ridge suddenly leaned to the right, bending like tall grass in a breeze. The same moment the grass strip in the valley floor stilled completely. The wind flags behind the line snapped harder for 2 seconds and then relaxed again. Briggs lowered the spotting scope slightly and whispered without meaning to, "It is changing." Dean Carter heard him. The old man's voice came quietly from the mat. "Yes." He adjusted the rifle a fraction of an inch, sliding the bipod feet deeper into the gravel. The movement was so small most of the Marines would have missed it if they had blinked. Gunnery Sergeant Cole stepped closer, now standing directly behind the mat, his shadow stretching across the ground beside Dean. "You still waiting?" Cole asked. Dean did not look up. "The valley is settling." Cole glanced downrange again. To him it looked the same as it had all morning. Wind, heat, mirage, chaos. But Briggs saw it. The twisted air above the rock shelf had softened slightly. The ripple along the grass line was beginning to drift in the same direction as the ridge current instead of against it. For a brief moment, the valley currents were aligning. Briggs felt his pulse pick up. Dean slowly lowered his cheek to the stock and placed his eye behind the optic again. The old rifle looked almost delicate compared to the massive precision systems beside it, but the way his hands rested on the worn walnut made the weapon appear perfectly balanced. His breathing slowed until even the Marines nearby could barely see the movement of his shoulders. The entire firing line had fallen silent. No one adjusted turrets. No one checked wind meters. Even the quiet electronic chirp of ballistic calculators had stopped. Dean Carter's finger rested lightly along the trigger guard, not yet touching the trigger itself. His gaze remained through the optic, but his awareness seemed to extend far beyond the glass. Across the valley, the wind flags flicked again. The ridge current leaned gently to the right. The grass strip moved the same direction now, slow and steady. Briggs leaned forward behind his spotting scope, his voice barely louder than a breath. "It is lining up." Dean Carter exhaled softly, the sound almost lost in the wind. For the first time since he had taken position behind the rifle, he spoke again. "Now we listen." The valley seemed to hold a single long breath. Dean Carter's cheek rested against the worn walnut stock, and his eye remained steady behind the simple optic. The world through that glass was small and quiet. A distant steel plate. A ribbon of pale grass. The broken ridge of sun-baked stone. But beyond the scope, his awareness stretched across the entire valley like a map drawn from memory. The wind touched his face again, lighter now, brushing across his left cheek before slipping away downrange. Gunnery Sergeant Ethan Cole stood behind him without speaking. The usual sharp confidence in his posture had softened into something closer to respect. Even he could feel that something on the range had changed. 10 Marine snipers lay motionless behind their rifles, their expensive wind meters forgotten beside them. The computers that had guided every calculation all morning now sat silent while the old man listened to something they could not measure. Lance Corporal Noah Briggs pressed his eye into the spotting scope, his heart beating slightly faster as he watched the valley currents settle. The mirage above the rock shelf leaned gently to the right. The thin grass strip across the valley floor moved the same direction, now in a slow, steady flow. For a few seconds, the invisible rivers of air were no longer fighting each other. They were traveling together. Briggs whispered quietly, almost afraid to break the moment. "It is still holding." Dean Carter did not answer. His breathing had slowed until each inhale and exhale blended into the rhythm of the wind itself. His right hand rested along the rifle, fingers relaxed, patient. The old gouge on the walnut stock lay beneath his thumb like an old memory. A memory of other valleys, other winds, long before digital solvers and satellite weather models existed. Dean eased the bolt forward with a soft mechanical click that barely carried beyond the mat. The sound seemed louder than it should have been in the silence. Cole's eyes shifted to the rifle for a moment, noticing the simplicity of the action. No glowing display. No electronic assistance. Just steel, glass, and a man who had learned to read the air the hard way. Dean's finger moved from the guard and settled gently against the trigger. Not pressing, just resting there. Through the optic, the steel plate looked almost unreal in the shimmering distance. Nearly 1 mile of shifting air lay between the muzzle and that piece of metal. A distance most shooters would trust only to mathematics. Dean trusted the valley. The wind brushed the flags again. Not sharply this time. Smooth. Aligned. Briggs felt it before he saw it. The mirage held steady. The grass line leaned right. The ridge current matched it. 3 winds moving together for a brief, narrow window. "It is there," Briggs breathed. Dean Carter exhaled slowly, letting half the breath leave his lungs and holding the rest in quiet balance. The rifle settled as naturally as if gravity itself had guided it into place. For a moment, the entire range seemed to freeze. No footsteps. No voices. Only the faint whisper of wind sliding through dry grass nearly a mile away. Dean Carter listened for one final heartbeat of silence inside the valley. Then the old rifle spoke. The sound of the shot rolled across the desert like a sharp crack of dry timber snapping in the heat, brief and clean, disappearing almost instantly into the wide, empty valley. Dean Carter did not move after the trigger broke. The old rifle settled back into the mat with quiet familiarity, the recoil absorbed through the worn walnut stock, as if the rifle itself understood the moment. Nearly a mile away, the steel plate remained motionless for a heartbeat. Then another. Time stretched thin across the firing line as every Marine stared downrange. Gunnery Sergeant Ethan Cole leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing toward the distant shimmer where the target stood. Lance Corporal Noah Briggs pressed his face deeper into the spotting scope, his breath held so tightly that even the wind seemed louder inside his ears. The bullet traveled through air that had already begun to change again. The ridge current softened. The grass line twitched. The narrow alignment that had existed seconds earlier slowly unraveled as the valley resumed its restless shifting. But the bullet had already passed through that window. 3 seconds after the shot, the quiet afternoon was broken by a distant, unmistakable sound. A clear metallic ring drifted back across the valley. Not loud, not dramatic, just a clean, sharp note that carried through the warm air like a bell struck once. For a moment, nobody on the firing line reacted. The Marines seemed almost unsure they had heard it correctly. Briggs pulled away from the spotting scope with wide eyes. "Impact," he said softly. The word spread through the line like a ripple through water. One Marine lifted his head from behind his rifle. Another slowly exhaled a breath he had been holding. A third looked down at the ballistic tablet beside him as if expecting it to explain what had just happened. Gunnery Sergeant Cole stared downrange for another long second before his gaze returned to the old man, still lying calmly behind the rifle. Dean Carter remained perfectly still, his cheek resting lightly against the stock, his eye no longer looking through the optic, but out across the valley itself. After a moment, he eased the bolt open with a quiet metallic click and rolled gently onto one elbow, pushing himself upright with the careful movement of someone who had done the same motion thousands of times over a lifetime. The Marines watched him sit up, as if the simple act carried more weight than the shot itself. Cole stepped forward slowly until he stood beside the mat. For the first time since the morning began, he did not speak immediately. His eyes moved from the distant steel plate back to the old rifle resting across the gravel. Finally, he nodded once. "That was a 1-mile shot," he said quietly. Dean Carter brushed a small trace of dust from the walnut stock with the side of his hand. "It was a valley shot," he replied. Cole considered that answer for a moment before looking down the line at his Marines. They were still staring at the distant target as if the steel plate had suddenly become something new. The wind flags had already begun moving in different directions again. The valley had returned to its usual shifting rhythm. The narrow window had closed as quickly as it appeared. Cole turned back to Dean. "You waited for the alignment." Dean nodded slightly. "The valley offered it." Briggs looked through the spotting scope again and saw the steel plate rocking gently on its mount nearly a mile away. He lowered the scope slowly, his voice quiet with something close to awe. "You let the wind carry the bullet." Dean Carter stood and lifted the old rifle from the mat, settling it back into the cloth covering with the same care he had shown earlier. He looked down the line of young Marines and gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Respect the wind," he said softly. "It will teach you more than any machine ever will." The range remained quiet long after the steel stopped moving.